Pericles' biggest miscalculation, however, had nothing to do with sanitation or overcrowding.
Where he went wrong was in underestimating the effect on morale of being in effect cowardly. Going behind your walls, seeing the Spartans come and doing nothing. That went against the grain of the Greek code of hoplite morality.
When the Spartans marched on Attica the following summer, Pericles' strategy was clearly under fire. Yet no one could possibly have foreseen what would happen next.
Athens was hit by a terrible plague, which wiped out something like a third of the population in Athens. Think about what that would mean. Translate that into American terms. I mean, you're talking about what, 90 million people?
The deadly disease, probably brought aboard a grain ship from Egypt, turned the streets of Athens into corridors of horror. The city was littered with dying men. Young and old, rich and poor fell victim. The plague played no favorites.
The effect of the plague was to cast Athens, and consequently its army and navy, into a state of disarray.
And suddenly, the Athenian game plan doesn't look great. It also kills Athens' leader, Pericles, and suddenly the man with the plan is no longer around to pursue it.
The death of Pericles left Athens prey to hostile factions and reckless leaders. But what also died was even more profound: his extraordinary vision.
And that caused extreme problems for the Athenians because there was no obvious succession to him. He hadn't planned one, and it was a democratic city. There was no government, and the individuals who each thought they ought to be the successor had rather different views, and they lacked the authority of Pericles. So Athens was in a difficult position.
In addition to the devastating losses, the plague also inflicted enormous psychological damage on the Athenians. Their faith in the gods was rattled, their self-confidence severely shaken.
And in the aftermath of this, they sue for peace. The Spartans think they're going to win, and they turn down the peace offer, and the war goes on.
The Athenians all of a sudden have become wimps, is the way it would have looked to the Spartans. They won't come out and fight us. They've never done that before. And therefore, it's terrible for us to make peace, I think the Spartans must have said, but people don't even have the guts to come out and fight.
They broke their back for the moment, but the Athenians are kind of like the Americans. They're tremendously resilient people.
And so, Athens assembled 250 triremes, making it the largest naval deployment of the war. Following a revolt on the island of Lesbos, they made use of this force and blocked the harbors of Mytilene. The next year, 427 BC, Athenian general Nicias led Athens to victory at Minoa. The Spartans countered with a decisive win at Plataea. And so went the Peloponnesian War, from city to port to island, all over the Aegean. Strike and counterstrike, revolt and forced submission.
And so both Athens and Sparta, in the first few years of the war, are really in pretty desperate straits. Neither of them really has a way to win this thing.
Despite their resolve, the Athenians especially felt the chilling effects of war. Their population was devastated, their land ravaged, and their treasury nearly exhausted. Still, as the campaign season of 425 approached, Athens valiantly prepared for battle. That summer at Pylos, on the western shores of Greece, the Athenians forced the unprecedented surrender of 120 Spartan equals. Shattered forever was the carefully cultivated myth that neither force nor famine could make the Spartans give up their arms.
The Spartans were so upset at this loss of Spartan manpower, and also, by the way, nobody could believe that Spartans ever surrendered. It was inconceivable. It never happened before, so that they just wanted to wipe this whole thing out, but they also didn't want these men to be killed. It was these hostages that finally compelled the Spartans to make peace.
But on what terms? After 6 grueling years of fighting, no useful result could be claimed by either side. Sparta was unable to liberate Greece from the grip of the Athenian Empire, while Athens had failed in its quest for absolute security, the very reason Pericles risked war in the first place. The expenditure of lives, suffering, and money, it seemed, was all in vain. Eventually, an uneasy peace would be brokered, then shattered, thanks to one of history's most colorful and unpredictable characters. The humiliating surrender of the Spartans at Pylos in 425 BC completely altered the course of the Peloponnesian War. Sparta, with 120 hoplites imprisoned in Athens, had no choice but to seek peace, under terms extremely favorable to Athens. For the Athenians, this was one victory to be savored.
Spartans would never have come to this, no matter what happened to them, if something like that hadn't taken place.
All Greece resounded from the shock. Spartan soldiers had laid down their weapons and surrendered.
Sparta and Athens once again came to the table, but this time the political climate favored peace.
Both sides had very powerful reasons for wanting to make peace. The Athenians had lost Amphipolis in the north, a major city, and with access to timber, trade routes, and generally that whole part of the empire was therefore slightly destabilized. The Spartans had lost a significant number of individuals, captured in 425, held prisoner as hostage in Athens.
However, peace was elusive, and hostilities began to breed again. As the two sides drifted back towards war, Sparta threatened to fortify a post in Attica. With 120 Spartan soldiers still in captivity, it was risky. But the dangerous bluff worked, and Athens agreed to terms. The articles of the treaty, called the Peace of Nicias, were meant to be binding for 50 years. The fighting stopped, and the disgraced Spartan prisoners were finally set free.
Theoretically, both sides laid down their arms, but it was kind of like a peace between Russia and the United States. It was a Cold War.
Immediately there were problems. Several of Sparta's allies refused to accept the peace treaty, including Boeotia, Megara, and Corinth.
Peace of Nicias had to be consolidated by a separate agreement between Athens and Sparta, and that was in a way its undoing, because the other allies of Sparta and some of the allies of Athens thought, what are Sparta and Athens up to? What do they know that we don't? And there were particular outstanding grievances on both sides.
Meanwhile, in Athens, a leader emerged, a man who loved to mock authority and rile the conservatives. A man who would prove to be one of the most flamboyant characters in history. His name, Alcibiades.
Something of a tremendously ambitious guy, something like a JFK plus General Patton, sort of a forerunner of Alexander the Great, in that he came from an extremely wealthy family, had tremendous ambition, great war hero, student of Socrates, etc., etc.
His father died when he was young, and he was a ward of Pericles, raised by Pericles in the great man's house. And I think that's a critical thing. You don't have to be Dr. Freud to see the influence here. For the rest of his life, he tried to be greater than Pericles, because that's the kind of personality that he had, which was mighty tough.
He is loved by men, he is loved by women. He's clearly the most charming and most exciting man of his time, and he's a chameleon.
Alcibiades was also unscrupulous and fabulously persuasive. He quickly forged alliances with some key Peloponnesian city-states, including Elis, Mantinea, and Argos. Predictably, this forced a confrontation with Sparta, and the uneasy peace of Nicias began to unravel.
Meanwhile, the Argives are putting together an independent league of democracies in the Peloponnesus who want to fight Sparta, and Athens joins them, and there's this enormously important day in the history of the Greek world, in the history of democracy, that nobody knows about. It is the day of the Battle of Mantinea, which takes place in the year 418.
Located right in Sparta's backyard, Mantinea was a battle that had to be won.